for our final story, we shift focus to South Africa, where the latest twist in tensions with the United States could have huge ramifications for the nation's economics. A new Senate bill is aiming to extend the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or AGOA, for a further 2 years, but has triggered fresh diplomatic tensions by proposing the explicit removal of South Africa from the trade programme.
Very important role that they should be playing as the biggest economy. I would say that the United States needs to think again whether boycott politics actually works, because in my experience it doesn't. It's better to be inside the tent.
The United States thought it could send a warning to South Africa by pushing a major African trade deal forward without it. The message was supposed to be clear: fall in line or be left behind. But instead of weakening South Africa, the move exposed something far more dangerous for Washington: a loss of leverage. What followed wasn't isolation, but acceleration, new partners, new routes, new power. And in the process, the United States may have weakened its influence across an entire continent.
The move was meant to be quiet, technical, and corrective. On paper, it looked like a trade policy adjustment. In practice, it was a message. When policymakers in Washington floated the idea of reshaping a major African trade framework without South Africa at its center, the intention was clear: apply pressure, discipline a partner seen as drifting, and remind the continent who still held the leverage. Instead, the signal was received very differently across Africa and beyond. What was supposed to narrow options ended up widening them. What was meant to isolate instead accelerated independence. And what was framed as strategic firmness exposed a growing weakness in United States influence over a continent that no longer sees the world in one direction. The attempt to sideline South Africa did not diminish its relevance. It amplified it. It did not restore control. It revealed how much control has already slipped. The trade framework at the heart of this story was originally designed to do two things at once: encourage African exports into the United States market and anchor economic relationships within a political orbit shaped by Washington. Preferential access was the incentive, alignment was the expectation. For years, South Africa played a complex role in this system. It was not just another beneficiary. It was the industrial engine, the logistics hub, and the manufacturing anchor that made regional value chains viable. When debates emerged about continuing the framework without South Africa, the reasoning followed a familiar pattern. South Africa was portrayed as too independent, too willing to diversify partnerships, too resistant to external pressure. By threatening exclusion, the United States hoped to force recalibration. The message was simple: access is conditional, and influence still flows one way. But this logic depended on an outdated assumption: that South Africa needed the arrangement more than the arrangement needed South Africa. That assumption no longer holds. South Africa's economy is deeply integrated into the continent. Its ports, factories, financial systems, and supply chains connect multiple neighboring economies into functional trade corridors. Remove South Africa from a preferential framework, and the damage does not fall neatly on one country. It fractures entire regional production networks that depend on scale, reliability, and infrastructure. By signaling willingness to move forward without South Africa, the United States effectively told African producers that integration anchored around regional industrial hubs was negotiable. That created uncertainty not just for South Africa, but for exporters across the continent who rely on those hubs to reach global markets. In trade, uncertainty is corrosive. And when uncertainty originates from one partner, others start looking for alternatives. This is where the move truly backfired. Rather than isolating South Africa, the proposal accelerated conversations that were already underway. Businesses, policymakers, and investors began asking a sharper question: why remain dependent on a single trade gatekeeper whose terms can shift with political moods, when diversification is both possible and increasingly attractive? South Africa did not respond with panic. It responded with options: trade ties with fast-growing Asian markets, deeper engagement with fellow emerging economies, stronger South commercial flows, and expanded intra-African trade suddenly moved from long-term strategy to near-term priority. None of these paths were new. What changed was urgency. The message from Washington effectively validated the argument that over-reliance on any one external partner carries risk. At the same time, the United States underestimated how much leverage it surrendered by even entertaining exclusion. Influence works best when it is quiet and assumed. The moment it is brandished as a threat, it becomes a tool that can be neutralized. African governments watching this unfold did not see a show of strength. They saw conditionality weaponized against the continent's most industrialized economy. The lesson was unmistakable. If it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. That realization does not encourage loyalty. It encourages hedging. South Africa's ability to hedge is precisely why the move failed. Unlike smaller economies dependent on a narrow range of exports, South Africa has depth. It produces complex manufactured goods. It processes minerals into higher value outputs. It hosts sophisticated financial and legal services. It sits at the center of logistics networks that serve an entire region. These assets cannot be easily bypassed. When trade frameworks exclude such a node, they become less efficient, less attractive, and ultimately less competitive. Investors know this. Supply chain managers know this. Competing global partners know this too, and they are ready to step in. The United States also misjudged the political optics. By proposing a framework that advances without South Africa, Washington inadvertently positioned itself as a divider rather than a partner. In a period where African nations are emphasizing unity, self-determination, and continental integration, exclusionary tactics feel out of sync with the moment. South Africa, meanwhile, benefits from time. Trade diversification is not instantaneous, but momentum matters. Each signal that access to the United States market is uncertain makes alternative arrangements more attractive. Over time, volumes shift, habits change, and dependencies erode. Once that happens, restoring influence becomes far harder than preserving it would have been. There is also a deeper strategic irony at play. The original framework was designed not just to boost trade, but to anchor the United States as a central economic partner in Africa. By weakening ties with the continent's most industrialized economy, Washington undermines the very architecture that sustained its relevance. Without South Africa, the framework risks becoming narrower in scope and impact. Smaller economies gain access, but without a strong industrial anchor, their exports remain concentrated in raw or low-value goods. That limits growth, reduces mutual benefit, and makes the arrangement less compelling over time. South Africa, on the other hand, continues building leverage through regional value chains. Control over processing, manufacturing, and logistics translates into long-term influence. Countries exporting raw materials increasingly seek partnerships that help them move up the value ladder. South Africa is positioned to offer exactly that. This is why the idea of sidelining it produces the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of bending policy, it strengthens autonomy. Instead of constraining options, it multiplies them. For the United States, the loss is not immediate, but it is structural. Trade credibility is hard to build and easy to erode. When access is framed as a political tool rather than a mutual economic benefit, partners begin to discount its reliability. Future negotiations become harder. Commitments are viewed as temporary. Long-term planning shifts elsewhere. There is also a signaling effect beyond Africa. Other regions watching the situation see a pattern. Preferential access tied closely to political alignment, with penalties for divergence. In a world moving toward multipolarity, that approach is increasingly costly. Countries with choices will use them. The irony is that the United States still has much to offer. Market size, investment capital, technological expertise, and consumer demand remain powerful attractions. But power today is negotiated, not assumed. Influence must compete. By attempting to pressure South Africa through exclusion, Washington treated influence as something it could still unilaterally withdraw and reassign. The response showed otherwise. The bigger picture is impossible to ignore. Across the global economy, countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are asserting greater agency. They are not rejecting engagement with the United States. They are rejecting dependency. They are building portfolios of partnerships, not pledges of allegiance. South Africa embodies this shift. Its strategy is not about choosing one side over another. It is about keeping doors open, options flexible, and national interests at the center. That posture resonates across the continent. especially among economies seeking to escape historical patterns of extraction and conditional access. In this context, the attempt to reshape a major trade framework without South Africa looks less like strategy and more like miscalculation. It underestimated resilience. It overestimated leverage. And it ignored the direction of global change. What was framed as pressure turned into permission for South Africa and others to accelerate paths they were already exploring. Permission to say that no single market is indispensable. Permission to design trade relationships on their own terms. The United States did not lose influence because South Africa was defiant. It lost influence because it misread the moment. This was never just about tariffs or eligibility criteria. It was about power in a changing world. And in that world, power flows toward those who offer stability, respect autonomy, and build partnerships that survive disagreement. The final lesson is stark. Attempts to sideline pivotal players rarely shrink them. More often, they reveal who still believes exclusion is control and who has already moved beyond that era. What was intended as a corrective measure may well accelerate a long-term shift, a continent more confident in its choices, and a South Africa more anchored in its independence. This was not merely an adjustment to a trade framework. It was a strategic gamble that exposed declining leverage, encouraged diversification, and strengthened the very autonomy it sought to restrain.